Hello, hello, hello. Thank you all so much for showing up to our second expansion chat event. My name is Marvin, community lead here at Gnosis Guild. We are a society for interdependent software and a core contributor to a collection of composable DAO tools that we call Zodiac. We're currently working on a host of exciting projects, including more Zodiac tools, a library of DAO patterns and resources for a cross-organizational wiki site, and we'll soon be experimenting with NFT governance, among many other things. So today, we are joined by Kelsie, Nabben, and Michael Zargham to talk about resiliency in the context of decentralized organizations. How are y'all doing? Are we all awake?
Doing well.
Doing well.
Yeah, sure. Good to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you all here. I'm so glad we could make this all work. There's not a huge window of time that allows for like a decent overlap between the US, Berlin, and Australia. So big thanks, Kelsie. I know it's early for you, and Kia too. I know it's bedtime for you.
Your pleasure.
No problem. A little sleepy, but all good.
All right, so we'll get to proper intros in just a bit, but I wanted to mention a few things right off the bat. First, the audio of this event is being recorded and will eventually be posted online. Second, the format of today's event is like a reading group style discussion. So I'll be reading excerpts from several texts and then pausing for discussion. I've shared a Notion link with the excerpts, but we'll also paste in the chat as I read them so you can follow along. In case you're not already in there, we're in the expansion chat channel, so all good if you want to just sit back and enjoy, but we also love seeing parallel conversations in addition to what's happening here on stage. So please join in there if you feel like dropping comments, questions, links, whatever you like. It's a nice little advantage to using Discord over something like Twitter Spaces. So yeah, I think we should take advantage of that. We'll also be monitoring the chat for questions throughout. So if you have any questions, drop them there, or else we could save them too for the end if there's time for a Q&A. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's do some intros. Kelsie, can you kick things off with an intro on who you are, what you do, background info, anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, for sure. So thanks again for having me here and excited for this conversation. And it's really great to connect with Gnosis Guild. I look forward to hearing a bit more about the community here. And maybe that's a hint that I am an ethnographer, so I'm a researcher at RMIT University in Australia. I'm currently doing my PhD, and that's on resilience in decentralized communities, or decentralized technologies, per se. And I'm particularly interested in the socio-technical systems, so the social dynamics or the community aspects of these systems. As well as that, I'm really fortunate to be quite engaged in the space. So I worked for a DEX project, Omise Go, back in the day, prior to kind of making the transition to becoming an academic sort of style researcher. And really glad to still be working with a number of projects, some of that in conjunction with BlockScience.
Awesome, thank you so much. Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Zargham. I usually go by my last name. I'm an engineering researcher. My background is in technically robotics and control of large-scale distributed systems. It's interesting to kind of come to the DAO space and see the sort of resurgence of a lot of ideas that sort of for me are old ideas. When I was an undergraduate, first working on a little mix of materials, civil engineering, and environmental stuff, just starting to convert into robotics. I read a lot of the cybernetics literature, and so that literature largely blends sort of biologic and ecologic thinking with engineering and sort of scientific methods. So I've been sort of lucky enough to have worked with a couple really expert multi-agent systems sort of swarm robotics type folks, and then I carried that over into a little bit of work briefly in industry after finishing my PhD, finding I wasn't totally in love with the work environment, the sort of nature of being a essentially a head of a data science group. And I quit and founded BlockScience, and have spent the last 5 years building essentially a research practice at the boundary of theory and application. We operate BlockScience in a sort of hybrid mode where it's a little bit guild-like, ironically, in that we have some master level people who have tons of complementary experience, and a broader group of collaborators who are, at various levels of expertise, but like working together to level up. And we do a lot of our internal decision making via a sort of council. So we do a little bit of experimenting with our own governance and doing lots of cool research projects, trying to blend the basic research like developing and iterating on the CAD/CAD framework for model-based systems engineering, generalized dynamical systems for mathematical theory, and some other work related to just sort of the application of those tools to operationalizing decentralized orgs. It's a lot of carryover from what I mentioned earlier, that sort of understanding of large scale systems and what it takes to get them to operate sustainably and continue to operate, not just to launch them. So I think hopefully that will be an interesting contribution to the discussion of resilience in DAOs.
I just love it. Thank you so much. That context is super helpful. Kia, I think a lot of you know Kia, but do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, I'm Kia, so kind of co-initiator of Gnosis Guilds. I've been working the last 4.5 years at Gnosis on strategy and communications. My background is more in philosophy, worked in an art context and then an organizing context, and basically I've been able to thread all of those interests together in my role now. I'd say what I enjoy most doing is kind of writing about all the work that we're doing here and elsewhere, and just really inspired by everybody's work here who's on the talk today, and I'm really looking forward to diving into it.
Cool. Thank you all. So excited and really just honored to have you all here. Like I said, the topic today is resiliency in the context of decentralized organizations. While this is an important topic, it's really not something that's, I guess, foregrounded in the DAO ecosystem. So I think it might be good if we just start off slow here a little bit and just try to make sure we're all coming into this conversation with a shared understanding. So this first excerpt is from Kelsie's latest piece on her Substack. It's titled, "What is Resilience?" Let me just paste the text here. Okay, so resilience is a multidisciplinary and widely interpretable term. Originating in mathematical observations of ecosystem dynamics, the concept of resilience is adopted in the study of ecology, social systems, including individual human psychology, communities, organizations, and cities, information technology, and engineering. Resilience is a concept originally proposed to understand the dynamics of social ecological systems. Ecological economist C.S. Holling uses the language of communications and cybernetics to rethink popular notions of resilience as relations in ecosystems. Holling proposes that a stability view of systems emphasizes the quantitative study of the maintenance and constancy in behavior of a system's performance in relation to system goals, whereas a resilience view emphasizes the persistence of relationships within a system and is a measure of the ability of these systems to absorb changes and still persist. Another related concept to resilience by which to inquire of it is the notion of vulnerability. Hummels and others define vulnerabilities as emergent and relational properties that pervade everyday life and are firmly embedded in the context in which they emerge. Vulnerabilities can include environmental factors, power structures, or other properties that are co-produced between technical and social factors in technological cultures. Vulnerabilities can also coexist, compete, and intertwine in multiplicity. Furthermore, once vulnerabilities are identified, they can be governed to improve adaptive capacity through various mechanisms, including balance systems, community relations, knowledge, and the rules or functions of technology. So before moving on onto how this concept of resilience impacts DAOs, I'd love if we could just step back and unpack a bit, especially these two major concepts that are being conveyed here, which are resiliency and vulnerability. So let's start with resiliency. Kelsie, or anyone really, can you speak on this concept of organizational resilience and how we can start to understand why it's so important?
Yeah, so maybe I'll jump in and then I might throw to Zargham to talk about robustness and resilience, which was kind of pointed to in that Holling comment. So as I point out in this piece on what is resilience, which is actually an excerpt from the methods section of my PhD, but I really wanted to make sure I shared it to kind of preempt this conversation as a kind of a bit of a foundation for us. Resilience has meaning across all these different fields, and this piece goes on to explain how resilience as a concept has also been politicized. So resilience is this idea that, and as I pointed out before, a socio-technical system, so both the social and the technical elements in a system, so the people and the kind of tools as they form an infrastructure, could be adaptable and transformable in response to threat or crisis. So if something happens, how does the system comprised of those human and machine elements adapt and respond to continue to persist or exist towards its goal? And so that's the kind of definition that I adopt in my research, where I'm trying to investigate and understand some of the social dynamics or social outcomes of decentralized technologies. And I think it's really interesting, especially that sort of component of adaptability in that definition. So Zargham, I'll let you kind of add more to this, but the idea that threats or perturbations to the system are occurring, and in decentralized technology we can talk about some of what those sort of perceived or real threats might be, whether that's the threat of state surveillance or the threat of a hack to a blockchain, and then how the system responds. Zargham?
Yeah, so I mean, when you mentioned tapping me in, you brought up this concept of robustness, and I'd like to clarify resilience and robustness. I find it really helpful in the sort of way this is usually taught, or at least in my experience for engineering, is that you think about a big oak tree as being robust and like a sapling as being resilient. And the reason this is the example is because you imagine a big windstorm, and the big oak tree under most circumstances just doesn't move at all, right? It just like takes it, and it goes unchanged, and it sort of survives the perturbation or survives the effect by just simply weathering it unchanged. The sapling sort of bends, but then kind of comes back up straight. And so the bounce back bit is sort of what we think of as resilience, and the sort of holding fast is what we think of as robustness. And the truth is that in our socio-technical systems, we have both, and they are sometimes in tension with each other. And the reason I bring this up with regards to DAOs is that, one, we can have vulnerabilities that are created or managed with one or both of these kinds of responses, and two is that some of the concrete decisions that we have to make actually lend us further in one direction or the other. So if we have an immutable system that we literally can't change, we're actually talking about something more in the direction of a robustness property, because there may be circumstances where it is broken and we can't do anything to fix it because it's immutable, like there was God forbid, a bug in some code that can't be changed. At best, you can deploy a new contract and try to move everybody onto it, but the original thing could be in some sense thought of as, it's immutable, so you doesn't have adaptive capacity. The other extreme is to have something that's relatively easily changed, and thus through the interplay with the social system can be adapted in response to circumstances that arise. And so I like to draw out both concepts, put them side by side, recognize one as like having adaptive capacity and exercising it to recover, which is resilience, versus robustness, which is actually a lack of adaptive capacity that allows you to sort of weather some perturbations or actually have fewer vulnerabilities in a different regard. And they're kind of complementary, but they're also kind of antagonistic to each other. So when we get into discussing how vulnerabilities relate, it's often interesting to talk about whether the particular vulnerability is best addressed through, an adaptive process that, manifests as a resilient socio-technical system, or potentially is better addressed with something where we shrink the set of changes that are possible in order to create this robustness, and putting those two things alongside as tools.
Thanks for that clarification. That's super helpful. Just so we're all clear, Myri, I'm not sure how to say your name exactly, but Myri, she had a question. How does resilience relate to anti-fragility? Are they complementary or alternatives?
I can answer that. Generally, anti-fragility is defined in terms of a super resilience. Resilience generally means recovering back to where you were. Anti-fragility is generally defined as being even better off afterwards, but it also invites the discussion of the goal, something we mentioned briefly in the excerpt, the goals of organizations. But you can't actually be better off unless you have a better off in terms of something. So resilience kind of makes sense even before we've described the specific goal, but anti-fragility sort of requires some sort of other purpose for you to have improved with respect to in response to the perturbation.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Yeah, these were great explanations and clarifications. Yeah, so we have this sort of basic understanding now of resilience and the role that vulnerabilities play. So I think it might be worth applying these concepts to DAOs specifically. So yeah, I'll read the second excerpt now, this time from Kelsie's piece called DAO Vulnerabilities. The statement...
Marv, can I just jump in on two things?
Yeah,
two things
of course. No, please.
Yeah, wonderful. So the first point is I just wanted to point out that, Zargham's definition here has been a systems definition. It starts to get to that systems thinking, and he mentioned cybernetics as a kind of disciplinary approach in his first comment, and I think that's important to call out. And so I guess part of how Zargham and I ended up researching together, so in a kind of complementary manner, it was a couple of years of just regular, informal sort of ongoing research collaborations before we ended up working together. We're kind of treating ethnography then in this system sense as a suitable approach to complement engineering approaches, as this kind of feedback loop. So in systems thinking, or specifically second order cybernetics, you want this second order feedback loop, or you want observation on the observation of what's happening in a system to kind of try and build a picture to maintain and improve that system. And so here we're taking a systems perspective when we go into the type of definition that Zargham pointed out, and then we're using ethnography as a method to actually try and create qualitative feedback or empirical insights to what's going on in this system. And so I point that out, that when we come to DAOs, that's the kind of research method that we're using. And then on the point of vulnerability, I'm sure perhaps you'll get to this, so I might leave vulnerability for the reading, but I just wanted to point out, as a methodological approach and from the disciplinary perspectives that we're coming from, that's the sort of way that our approaches synthesize when we step into a research setting, such as observing a DAO or studying it, or building it and then seeing what happens.
I got it. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're gonna get to some about vulnerabilities right here, actually. So yeah, so I'll get to this second excerpt. Goes, the statement, whoever controls infrastructure controls society, encapsulates the vision of decentralized technologies communities, who seek emancipation from the external forces of power and influence for their own self-determination. DAOs are one manifestation of this. Digital infrastructure is a powerful tool. They are an attempt at shaping the field of play by defining incentives and constraints for self-governance or autonomy outside of existing institutional infrastructures. This does not mean they are free of politics, self-interest, exploitation, and other forms of vulnerability or attack. The critical question for DAOs is, how can they legitimately design adaptive capacity into these systems, both human and algorithmic, whilst maintaining their call to decentralization to withstand the inevitable growing pains of evolving into functional infrastructure? Michael Zargham, founder and CEO of BlockScience, argues that, quote, it is important to make the governance surface explicit, and where possible, it is important the effects of tuning such a parameter are relatively straightforward. The next step after mapping the threats, vulnerabilities, and opportunities is to govern vulnerabilities through social and technical interventions. So, first off, can we give maybe some concrete examples of DAO-specific vulnerabilities, where they're coming from, and maybe how DAOs can map them?
So yes, but I also was wondering if we wanted to get Kia. I feel like we haven't let her speak yet. Do you want to go first?
I can say something for sure. It's a little late for me here, so I'll be a bit quieter than usual in the discussion. But one thing I was thinking of from the kind of earlier points, and to bring it back to this, is it's really so dependent on where you define the boundaries of the systems that you were talking about. Because I loved the example of robustness and resiliency and their difference, as well as Kelsie kind of foregrounding adaptability in your definition of resilience. And I was thinking so much about how you define adaptability potentially as, like, if you look at one system, you can say, well, that system changed from time A to time B. And you can say that, like, it intrinsically changed. But you need some sort of, well, in the normal conception, you need some sort of boundary to the system to say that change occurred at all or adaptation happened. And you have to say, like, whether it occurred outside the system or inside the system for it to be adaptation versus, like, forcing the environment to change. So you could almost imagine, like, robustness as, like, basically in some way forcing the environment to change, or like the wind has to go around you or something to this effect. And so I think in the context of DAOs, that becomes interesting, of where you define the kind of, obviously somewhat shifting in certain cases and somewhat strict in others, but where you define the boundaries of these systems or these organizations so much affects how you think about their adaptability, right?
100%.
So yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
So I'd love to riff off that, because so first off, the notion of the boundaries of the system comes up time and time again in sort of any sort of literature on this subject. So I know we're going to stay theory for a second, but then I'll jump into an example. It comes up in Ostrom in terms of, like, understand, like, literally explicitly in her sort of the summary of her findings in terms of principles. One of the principles is explicitly defining clear boundaries. It shows up in Stafford Beer, who is one of the sort of main organizational cybernetics, when he talks about the circumstances under which a functional unit or group might find itself excluded from the organization, insofar as it sort of fails to sort of continue to be part of the thing's identity. It can appear in terms of the way that we discuss our DAOs in terms of membership. So this is more recent work with the Metagov community on the DAO Star working group. We've talked a lot about what is membership, how does a DAO define its membership. We're dealing with the challenges of what does membership in a DAO relate to? Is it having the token? Is it participating in contributions? Is it ... It actually depends on the organization. And so then I usually come back to this question, and say, well, these are often overlaid on top of each other. So like you could be a member in some sense, but not in another. So you actually do have to start like making suggestive choices, drawing those dotted lines, and asking your adaptivity questions from a concrete frame of reference, but then acknowledging that that frame of reference affected your answer. So lots of theory, practically. I've been involved in the Gitcoin fraud detection and defense working group. We were doing some machine learning modeling and some analysis before Gitcoin DAO launched, and we sort of transitioned that into helping seed the FDD group, fraud detection and defense. It's a functional sub-DAO now, but one of the reasons that I think this is an interesting example is because there's a really obvious function being fulfilled. The quadratic funding mechanism has relatively high vulnerability to Sybil attacks, quite literally, and so the adaptation was a pretty large growth of an operational unit that does data analysis, machine learning, a large number of sub-functions that ultimately provide as a service to the DAO flagging and actually also some evaluation of basically when people contest, like you flag someone, assuming you're doing flagging, you also need to be able to handle, hey, I'm real. And so there's a variety of functions that grow. But if you put a like dotted line around that and you say, well, this sub-DAO or this entity exists, at least for now, for the purpose of fulfilling a function, a needed function, or securing a specific vulnerability that exists in the Gitcoin DAO, it's actually comparatively easy to describe the boundaries. It's the set of functions that contributes to fulfilling that purpose. And although the functions themselves actually change in time, the people fulfilling those functions evolve in time, the tools and infrastructures being used to do it might evolve over time. It's not that hard to hold that boundary as the set of people contributing to the set of functions contributing to fulfilling that one protect this vulnerability.
Yeah, Zargham, Marv actually mentioned the governance surface, talking about boundaries in one of the excerpts that he read. Do you want to just quickly define that for people?
Quickly. Sure. I do think it's a really important concept, but again, I'm going to do this thing where I do a little bit of theory first and then give an example. The little bit of theory first is, we talked about adaptive capacity before. I tend to define the governance surface in terms of the set of available actions in that for adaptive capacity. So like you don't necessarily exercise all of the powers that you have to adapt yourself. So it might be a set of parameters for which there are governance methods to change those parameters. It generally also includes, mechanisms that allow you to say upgrade your code, or otherwise, in a very technical setting, you can make explicit exactly the set of procedures through which you update your organization's rules. You might also think of it in a constitutional lens. If your code and maybe some, specific procedures around how you update code are a sort of constitution, then the constitutional amendment rules are the governance surface. It's the mechanisms through which you govern. And in a DAO setting, this is often most concretely manifest in terms of meta parameters that are accessible to the governance body, like parameter tuning. And my preferred concrete example is One Hive. I've spent time working on and off with that DAO for many, many years. And I've seen a pretty exciting evolution of that organization in terms of the deployment of new tools that eventually became the Gardens pattern. And over that lifetime, though, even those individual tools actually have parameters. And so there's a difference between sort of debating whether to deploy a whole new chunk of code or to fundamentally replace an existing smart contract with, say, tuning one of the conviction voting parameters, or changing there's also parameters for CEST. I don't need to go into the details of One Hive, but just to emphasize that if you have a series of smart contracts, you can have a sort of governance surface that represents all of these parameters that your governance mechanisms mutate, and that we have, again, a relatively good idea, or try to have a good idea, what the consequences of tuning those parameters are. For example, you could make it easier or harder to pass proposals in conviction voting by tuning the parameter that determines how much conviction is required to pass a funding proposal. If you tune that up, then the proposals will need to wait longer or acquire more support before they pass. And so even though the underlying mechanism is a little bit complex, the sort of first derivative of it is really obvious. Like if you tune it up a little bit, the effect is really obvious. And I do think there's a really big difference between understanding the full complexity of the consequences of a change and understanding the sort of first order effect of it. And this kind of goes to a much broader discussion of like, how do we deal with unintended consequences, and not just first order effects, but like second and third order effects, which are very common in these decentralized sort of systems, socio-technical systems in particular. Is that enough, Kelsie? I don't want to overdo it.
No, that was great.
That was brief. Good job.
Kelsie, Kia, do you want to go ahead?
Well, that's interesting to me because I really like the term governance surface, because I feel like early on in the culture of kind of the crypto space, that idea was ported in through like almost like the kind of like costume of attack surface. So thinking about potential vulnerabilities, and through like, I think, a side of the culture that's not necessarily one that we want to embrace, like the more kind of Szabo side that says basically any possible changes to governance open up a broader attack surface for governance, and therefore you should have less possible changes to your governance surface, right? And how you just described a governance surface is really defined through its adaptability. So I really prefer that definition, because there's a kind of like always like a trade-off in the sense that a parameter that can't be tweaked is still a parameter in a sense. And so I think that moving from kind of porting the attack surface metaphor to a governance surface metaphor is really useful, because otherwise you get the description that like governance should try to preclude adaptability at all costs to some extent.
You're 100% on it. In fact, this quote from, or this concept from Ashby, who's one of the like OG cyberneticists, about this thing, it's called requisite variety. It sort of variety appears in Ashby, and discussion of requisite variety appears in Stafford Beer's work. But basically it amounts to this argument that you're kind of making, that you need enough variety, or a big enough governance surface in our vernacular, to actually adapt, but also not so big that we have unnecessary threat surface. So we're like trying to figure out, what does it mean to make maybe the governance surface as small as possible but no smaller, where but no smaller implies that the system has requisite variety, or is capable of expressing enough different actions that it can meaningfully adapt to unforeseen circumstances. So it's like enough governance surface, but not too much. And trying to find like a theory space for reasoning about this and making design decisions about this has sort of led me to actually robustness and resilience, and this idea that too small of a governance surface might be robust but not resilient, and too big of a governance surface might allow for resilience, in the sense that the social part of the system can use that adaptive capacity to change the system, but you actually lose robustness because it's very malleable and in fact vulnerable to capture, because it's just got too many degrees of freedom in the social part of the system.
Kelsie, did you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think that point that Zargham just made is really well articulated, and to Kia's point as well, in Bitcoin, for example. So, quote unquote, immutable governance means a small amount of variety, or small sort of requisite variety, small governance surface. And so it's robust, meaning not much can change, but it's not adaptable in the sense that the actual form can transform in response to its environmental factors. And so an example of a vulnerability there that's sort of emerged as pressing in some ways to the legitimacy of the broader project is this idea that Bitcoin is bad for the environment. So that is not a technical vulnerability or a kind of a cyber attack or a sort of censorship thing, as more of a broader kind of ethos or perspective in some ways, and reality in others, obviously, if we're talking about sort of environmental factors there. So that's just one example, but I think the importance of this practice or effort to identify vulnerabilities is about trying to govern them. So that's why the governance surface is so important and interlinked here. And so I found this concept of vulnerability as a relational notion to resilience in the literature in science and technology studies. And then through conversations with BlockScience and other wonderful colleagues, started to develop this out into a model, which is kind of represented in a graphic in the article you read from, which breaks down, some potential kind of categories for vulnerability, whether it be social or technical, whether it be exogenous, so originating from outside the boundaries of, a DAO, for example, or endogenous. And there's so many vulnerabilities in DAOs, especially a lot of the social ones, but even, bug codes, to take the DAO hack as the first example, that are endogenous. And so they originate actually internal to the DAO, which is why this is important, because if the vulnerabilities are internal to the DAO, then they can potentially be governed before they become an issue, and that becomes part of that ongoing adaptivity and maintenance of the infrastructure.
Yeah, definitely. As I read through these articles, I think what initially struck me was how, at least through your list, the majority of vulnerabilities happen within the DAO itself, whereas I usually think of threats and vulnerabilities coming from external sources. Yeah, in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to the next excerpt. It kind of shifts in tone a little bit here. This next one is from Kelsie's article titled "Towards a Model of Resilience in Decentralized Socio-Technical Infrastructure." So it kind of offers a political context for some of this discussion. Resilience was sought via distribution of computing architecture against the threat of war by Paul Barron in the 1960s. It was then sought through cryptographic security of data and privacy through the work of public key cryptographers in the 1970s and 1980s. Resilience then became a political objective for autonomy from state control or intervention under the cypherpunks in the 1990s. The explicit overlay of political ambition to decentralized technologies introduces challenging dynamic when trying to establish decentralized governance. With infrastructure, no tool is neutral. These historical breakthroughs in distributed computing and public key cryptography culminated in the invention of Bitcoin in 2008, an architecturally decentralized, cryptographically secure coordination infrastructure that also promotes political decentralization by disintermediating centralized third parties through distributed consensus. So this past year, well, really, especially this past month, we've witnessed the emerging power of crypto in geopolitical contexts, namely the crowdfunding of millions for Ukraine. And there's, of course, the Ukraine DAO. What implications are there for resiliency in this context, and what do you all think is at stake here?
Yeah, great question. I'll jump right in on that, given the pause. So the politics of infrastructure is kind of a major theoretical lens that I like drawing on in my work, and I'll point people to the writings of Larkin in 2013, and this idea that infrastructure is expressive. It has both politics and poetics, I guess. But there's a lot of different writings that talk about how kind of technology is an expression of political will or preference, whether people mean it or not. So even by designing an algorithmic system or putting a stop sign on a road. Another theorist called Latour talks about how that is directing behavior and shaping society through those sort of technological interventions. And so we have public blockchains that emerge out of the cypherpunk culture, and that's an overtly political technology. So they're saying our agenda is political. We want to self-govern through these, coordination infrastructures that are peer-to-peer, and our means are technological. And so, looking at the political dynamics of DAOs is incredibly important, and I love what Kia pointed out before around this kind of governance ontology and how important that is. And so, one big piece of work that some of us at the BlockScience team on the kind of social research side just did was around Lido, and Lido actually reached out, the liquid staking protocol, and said, can you look at our governance and help us to identify vulnerabilities? Like, we want a third-party perspective. And one thing we talk about there is their governance ontology, and they have kind of a number of posts around, the road to trustless staking and this idea of, governance minimization. So remove as much as possible that can be kind of tampered with by fallible human intervention, and, minimize it, automate it, all of these things. And so we kind of dig into that, and we talk more about the process of Zargham called it requisite variety before we found the literature that actually articulates it. We called it kind of right sizing governance or sizing governance to where you can actually adapt. And so what we're seeing in the manifestation of examples like Ukraine DAO, where millions of dollars are being rapidly mobilized, are very, very agile, adaptive organizations. And I think it's really turning heads in terms of like the mainstream awareness and narrative of what DAOs are is no longer kind of, cute, weird software developer communities that are, doing investment Ponzi schemes. Like, they're political actors. And so that's what I argue in some of my thesis, and I actually have another piece on SSRN which talks about the metaverse and hardware in decentralized technologies, where I study a crypto state, which is a project called Kongland, who's manufacturing microchips. But in that I argue that, these kind of DAO communities that consider themselves self-governing polities are, major political actors on a geopolitical scale. So in matters such as microchip manufacturing, or like you say, funding kind of conflict or conflict resistant efforts. So I think it's a big deal, and it's a really important example to point out.
I want to sort of, while we're talking about the politics, I'm going to take it to a slightly different, like down a level, I think, if it's okay with you guys, to talk about the politics of the entity itself of a DAO versus the sort of politics you might say within it, or more specifically, I want to address the term autonomous with regards to its political interpretation, and I think this doesn't happen often enough. So I'm gonna grab the stage for a second to point out that at the level of drawing the boundaries of the organization and saying that we have a autonomous organization capable of self-steering, kind of collectively making its own decisions and doing stuff in the world, manifesting a thing and maintaining that thing and interacting with other political actors, remember that there's a recursiveness here, that within that organization there is a set of like sub-organizations, subgroups, stakeholder groups, individuals who have their own maybe minor variations in their interpretation of the goal, priorities, or preferences about how the goals are pursued. And so you do end up with a natural sort of internal politics as well, and that no notion of an organization can get away from this nesting problem, which is that even when we have some tools, protocols, processes through which we align our interest towards a shared goal, that within that, as long as it's made up of multiple actors, that sort of politicalness recurses. And so trying to eliminate it completely is often actually problematic because it pops up again like it's a whack-a-mole situation. So it's often better to, kind of tying back into our discussion of the governance surface, being clear about that, the existence of that, being clear about how one goes about participating in that political process, developing norms, or a mix of norms and rules about how that's undertaken, and in a sense allowing the sort of the autonomy of the actors within the organization to not be confused with the sort of autonomy of the organization relative to the outside world. And I brought it up because I thought it was a nice dovetail back into Kia's points about where you draw the dotted lines, because the very nature of organization is quite recursive, and I think that expresses itself as vulnerabilities most naturally in the tension between scales, meaning the members of the organization to the organization versus the organization to the quote outside, especially in the political context, actually.
I think that's interesting as well, because autonomy can be kind of defined spatially, or in a sense of related to the actors involved, right? So some actors or agents are autonomous in relation to other agents, whether in that system or kind of across it or across several. But also I think that a lot of the earlier kind of one thread of autonomy that people rely on is also related to kind of temporality. So the idea of the system being able to persist open-endedly into the future and to continue to persist. And that's somewhat related to the idea of adaptability, of like the system persists despite changing, but you can still recognize it as the system. And of course, this is like still within a very historical sense of a definition of resilience. But I wonder, and kind of even bringing it to a level further down, like I think most of the ways that we approach definitions of membership in DAOs and the ways that we're trying to kind of form these theoretical spaces to pin them down a bit more, often look at DAOs kind of at early stages in their life cycle. But it's very difficult for us, I think, to understand like the persistence of some of these organizations into the future. There's some that just peter out, but if there may be just like a token social graph and that social graph persists, like what is the actual exit point and what is the point at which the autonomy dwindles? And I think this is interesting as they become more political actors. What is the wind down process? What is the metamorphosis as potentially something like an organization speed run, raising funds at a particular moment of conflict? And as that evolves, there's no necessarily precedence for these organizations as they evolve yet, apart from maybe looking at Bitcoin or Ethereum to a certain extent as a DAO that kind of continues functioning with a peer-to-peer network. And we don't really have norms, definitions, or anything about like what that persistence in time means and how it comes to an end. Like we're going to have a lot of zombie DAOs rather than DAOs that like other systems might clearly die.
Yeah, I agree strongly, though I want to add some tethers, because I think this stuff is better precedented than we give it credit for in the cybernetics literature. I to spend about 2 weeks rereading a bunch of old literature as part of the literature review for a paper Kelsie and I are writing. And I, even having read this stuff, it's been a good 20 years since I read it. Rereading it, I was just repeatedly wowed by how nuanced the literature actually addressed some of these concepts. So that sort of resilience as persistence concept appears in beer as viability. It's the defining characteristic, and it's deeply tied to automation. And it's actually expressed in the broader literature as being consistent with what we think of as life. So the zombie DAO analogy is great. We end up with these sort of, we'll even imagine them as technical corpses that are sort of still running their the computational processes potentially to some extent, but the social sort of spirit essence is gone. That's sort of at least how I think about sort of the zombie socio-technical systems. The technical bits persist, but the social bits have the attention and effort has fled away. Maybe these things are less new if we're able to align them with other understandings of living things, so of living systems. And with that in mind in particular, I think that, one, you're totally right, we're going to see lots of things speed run their life cycles, but that there's a particularly interesting phenomena that we're starting to poke at, is which organizations and under what circumstances are those organizations sufficiently viable to live for long life cycles, to be I guess if we were borrowing from Taleb, to be Lindy in a sense. But what does that actually look like in the case of these particular DAOs, socio-technical systems with blockchain components or Web3 components? Again, we really can't know in the immediate sense because we don't have enough time. We haven't made observations over long enough scales. But I continue to sort of find myself not being so stressed about that and looking at them more from a broader, what does a living system look like? And I will throw this to Kelsie with maybe a peg on, do you want to talk about autopoiesis? Because that seems super relevant.
Yeah, flagged it. There's a couple of things I want to say just to what you said and to Kia's sort of comment and question there. So I think that variability and adaptability occurs in relationship to the purpose of DAOs. So I don't think persistence is necessarily the objective of all DAOs. And, a major threat to DAOs is regulatory uncertainty. So if I was one of the people kind of core involved in something, very overtly political on a global scale, resilience for those people as participants in that DAO might be for the DAO to, quietly disappear once that funding is deployed to, mitigate the threat of litigation. So it really depends on the purpose and intention. I dropped a link in the chat, and I feel like I always say this, but apologies for shamelessly self-referencing. I feel like I'm just kind of pulling ideas out of archives in my mind. But I have a piece on the life cycle of a DAO that kind of talks about some of these dynamics of the kind of cultural experiences and identity forming rituals of DAOs, from kind of creation and token allocation and distribution to just their existence, death via hack or lack of interest, as Zargham pointed out, and then, in many cases, kind of resurrection as well, to what you said, Kia, or to Zargham's point, when social attention comes back to that dead code or that dead infrastructure, it kind of gets reinvigorated through kind of participation or capital and all these things, which is kind of an interesting idea potentially. And so the next question was about autopoiesis, and that links very well again to this idea of what does it mean for DAOs to persist. So I definitely credit Zargham for surfacing this one again out of that old school, has been around, not the first time we're kind of inventing some of these ideas. So autopoiesis is the property of a living system that is able to sort of reproduce itself or maintain itself through kind of recreating its own parts. And so in a paper that Zargham and I are drafting at the moment that draws on this idea from cybernetics literature, we look at the way that DAOs kind of reproduce. And so Zargham mentioned before One Hive and the way that they have taken the fundamental kind of pillars of their governance. So the idea that they have, a set purpose, the type of voting signaling and mechanism that they use in conviction voting, and their decentralized court mechanism that they've built called CEST. And then they create a governance pattern out of this, which is called Gardens. And now Gardens is used by a number of other DAOs, and I know more that are investigating the adoption of this kind of pattern or how to adapt that to their purpose. So this is actually a really nice idea of this autopoietic system, which is able, it is living in a sense. It's like an organism that can kind of procreate and adapt. And I think that's what we're seeing when we start to think about the complexity and the multiple scales of DAOs when we're going from, it was one DAO to start as this kind of thought experiment to, DAO to DAO relations, which Zargham was heavily involved in kind of coining some of the initial thinking on that, to sub-DAOs and sub-DAO to sub-DAO relations, sub-DAO to DAO relations, and these kinds of multiple or nested scales of governance across these ecosystems where it becomes about DAOs kind of collaborating and coexisting to sort of procreate and recreate and reproduce in many ways.
You make a point there that I want to emphasize. I know we're about to wrap up, but that going even from biologic analogies to ecologic analogies goes, I think, is actually really important, because we've also started to see, as you sort of alluded to, explicit sort of passing of genetic traits around for DAOs, and giving birth to other DAOs. Maybe something starts as a sub-DAO, maybe it starts as a working group, it becomes its own DAO. In the sort of One Hive example case, you look at things like agave effectively spawning out of that and becoming its own DAO, but you also look at the sort of genetic material of One Hive, the Gardens template, suddenly and recently getting adopted by a half dozen DAOs after it got published as its own sort of thing that you could use. And so what we start to see there is complex relationships between both species and sort of instances of species into niches that actually complement each other. And so we start to see like a complex web of interactions between organizations filling each other's needs. And although I wouldn't say it's a perfect one-to-one analogy with a biologic, ecologic system model, there's a lot of intuition that can be drawn from a sort of institutional, ecological, economic perspective that helps us understand that these emerging organizations can not just have complex forms, they can have complex relationships with each other. Their relationships with each other can evolve, and their forms can evolve. And so you end up with these quite a rich way in which things interact, the organizations themselves interact. And I think we're actually only just starting to see the possibilities that come from what I would call an open source political economy. Literally, people are just publishing their own new ideas of how to organize themselves and how to organize the relationships between those organizations in a way that, at least for me, is familiar as the way open source software is developed. But now they're open source organizations, they're open source economic relations amongst and within organizations. And I see that as a kind of open source political economy, and something that is, again, just sort of the beginning of the exploration.
We're running up on time here already, so probably a good spot to start wrapping things up. Unfortunately, we have to, of course, skip the last quote in the Q&A. I had mentioned this in the chat, but I really didn't want to derail this conversation. It was just I liked it. I like it to unravel the way it did, and I think it was incredibly valuable to have. So thank you all. Kelsie, Zargham, Kia, really thank you so much. I'm truly astonished by really all of the value you all bring to the ecosystem, and I'm so happy we could get deep into a topic that I feel is important to understand, especially as DAOs, just start to truly grapple with their own longevity and persistence. So yeah, anyway, any parting thoughts or upcoming projects you want to share with the community before we check out here?
I heard that Gnosis is integrating gardens. I don't know, is that real?
Yeah.
Then huge
Wait.
snaps.
Gnosis Gardens integrated the Gnosis Safe via Zodiac already.
I saw some posts about that. I'll be honest with you. It's been a while since I've been hands on deck, since most of my contributions were in conviction voting and a little bit of like modeling support for the monetary policy upgrades. So I just saw it on Twitter.
Yeah, no worries. It's super cool. They did it so basically when you deploy a Gardens DAO, you can essentially connect to a safe treasury via Zodiac and then have access to all of our mods automatically. It's really wonderful, and I love the whole community around One Hive and Gardens for doing that from the start.
It makes me so happy. I just like the composability and the opportunities to explore. It's huge. So I wanted to give props for that. I just wanted to confirm that it was true. Fact checking Twitter.
Kelsie, do you have anything to say before we check out here?
Yeah, I'd just love to invite anyone to engage with our work or my work if you'd like. So yeah, feel free to ping me on Twitter or to subscribe to my Substack. Zargham and I have a really, really cool paper coming out soon, crossing my fingers here, on the foundations of decentralized governance, which tries to kind of clearly articulate and reference some of these ideas. And then we're also working on kind of methodological approaches to work with DAOs on this sort of vulnerability assessment and resilience across sort of social, technical, and economic dynamics. And there's brilliant practitioners in the team at BlockScience with sort of capabilities across those areas. So really happy to talk to people that are interested in that as well. And thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for coming in and engaging. Really appreciate you all. We'll have another expansion chat at the end of April, but we're also hosting casual weekly syncs for our Zodiac.wiki initiative. Those are happening on Friday, so please feel free to swing by and say hi. They're super casual. I'll also post a couple links in chat so you can sign up for our public calendar and mailing lists, and just to stay in the loop. So, all right.
Yeah.
Thanks again, everyone. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, we do have an exciting, we'll be announcing more about the Zodiac Wiki project and introducing kind of a different type of NFT governance system for the whole Zodiac ecosystem, which includes the standard, the tools, and the wiki. So, yeah. And thank you both, Z and Kelsie, for joining tonight as well, and Marv for wonderful hosting. Everybody have a lovely day.